On the 7th of December, a force of over 300 Japanese Navy fighter planes launched a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet base at Pearl Harbor, with no warning whatsoever. In just 2 hours, 20 American warships were turned into scrap metal, 300 aircraft were destroyed, and over 400 military personnel and civilians lost their lives. The sleeping giant had been rudely awakened. 4 years later, the United States played Santa Claus, bringing gifts to Japan, special presents for children who hadn't been good. 2 nukes the size of thighs, carefully wrapped and dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This devastating blow shook the nation of Japan to its core. A strike that not only made the samurai tremble, but also sent a message to the entire world. Don't be foolish enough to mess with America. After everything that had happened, people thought that no one and no force would dare violate American soil ever again. But in the terrorist training camps of Afghanistan, the desire for revenge against the world's #1 superpower had never been extinguished due to this nation's presence in the Middle East. With a dense network spanning over 40 countries, using the motto of violent revolution and invasion, spreading fear and terror worldwide, these masked figures had made their way to the United States. With everything they had prepared beforehand, they turned America's pride, commercial Boeing aircraft, into missiles of destruction, targeting symbolic structures and plunging America into the darkest day in its history. Yes, we're talking about the Izzy 11th of September attacks. That morning started like any other ordinary day, clear blue skies. And the people of New York City were breathing under what they thought was the safest canopy on the planet. Meanwhile, on the other side, a man named Mohammed Atta called Bin Laden and said, "Our plan is ready. 4 targets, 4 flights have been locked in. 11, 175, 77, and 93. 7 a.m. Logan International Airport, Boston, United States." The ringleader, Mohammed Atta, and his accomplice Abdul Aziz Al-Omari had just landed after taking flight 930 from Maine. Here, they met 3 other terrorists, Walid al-Shari, Wael al-Shari, and Satam al-Suqami. All 5 men successfully passed through security screening and boarded the plane as passengers, bringing the total passenger count to 81. This was American Airlines Flight 11. On its daily route from Boston to Los Angeles International Airport in California. The flight was operated on a Boeing 767-200, controlled by 11 crew members. The captain was John Oganowski, 50 years old, and the first officer was Thomas McGinnis, a former Navy fighter pilot. At 7:59, from runway 4R, the wide-body jet began takeoff. At 8 hours 13 minutes and 29 seconds, while flying over central Massachusetts at 26,000 feet, the pilots received instructions from Boston Air Traffic Control. American 11, turn right heading 020. More than 10 seconds later, Air Traffic Control continued, calling Flight 11, requesting the pilots climb to cruising altitude of 35,000. American 11, climb and maintain flight level 350. American 11, climb and maintain flight level 350. American. No response whatsoever. What the hell had happened? At 8:13, from seat 8D in economy class, Mohammed Atta signaled his accomplices. They used weapons to overpower the crew, injuring 2 flight attendants and a male passenger named Daniel Lewin. They threatened the attendants to open the door and stormed into the cockpit. The surprise attack, Atta and Al-Omari were able to overpower both the captain and first officer, seizing control of the aircraft. Outside the cockpit, the other accomplices forced all passengers to the back of the plane and threatened them with a bomb. At 8:16, 2 minutes after being hijacked, the plane was turned around at 29,000 feet and very quickly deviated from its planned route. Sounds resembling screams began echoing through the phone lines at Boston Control Center. They had an ominous feeling about Flight 11. By 8:21, the aircraft's Mode C transponder signal had been turned off. At 8:23, repeated calls were made. Good morning messages. ATC is looking for you on 135 Seon. Please contact Boston Center as soon as possible. They've lost radio contact and your transponder signal. Outside the cabin, flight attendants Amy Sweeney and Betty Ong tried to contact American Airlines. This is Betty, flight attendant on Flight 11. I think we're being hijacked. There might be no air traffic control. First-class passengers, 2 other flight attendants have been injured. We can't get into the cockpit. The door has been locked. At 8 hours 24 minutes and 38 seconds, ringleader Ada made an announcement to the passenger cabin. But he made a mistake, and this signal was accidentally sent to Boston Air Traffic Control. Nobody move. We are returning to the airport. Just stay quiet and everything will be fine. At 8:26, the aircraft moved at high speed heading south. At 8 hours 33 minutes and 59 seconds, the hijacker continued broadcasting a second message to passengers. We are returning to the airport. Don't try to make any foolish moves. At 8:37, air traffic control contacted Flight 175, which was on the same route as Flight 11, heading to California, carrying 56 passengers and crew members. At this time, Flight 175 had been airborne for 23 minutes and was maintaining steady altitude at 33,000 feet. United 175. Can you see American Airlines Flight 11? We can see Flight 11. They're at 29,000 feet. Thank you. United 175. Turn right heading 30 degrees to avoid collision. Shortly after, around 8:43, the pilots of Flight 175 called back to air traffic control, reporting they had heard unusual sounds coming from Flight 11. But just as the call ended, other hijackers who had been lying in wait on Flight 175 suddenly stormed the cockpit and killed both the captain and first officer. The ringleader was Marwan al-Shahi, a trained pilot who took control of the flight. By now, 2 flights had been hijacked by terrorists. Returning to Flight 11, Ada had now completed his final approach toward Manhattan, flying south toward the World Trade Center. At 8:46, flight attendant Amy Sweeney was horrified to discover their plane was flying dangerously low at speeds up to 710 km per hour. Seconds later, the massive Boeing crashed straight into the North Tower of the World Trade Center, twin towers between floors 93 and 99. Hundreds of people died instantly, including everyone on the plane and many others in its path. The fuel tanks containing up to 38,000 liters of gasoline exploded immediately, causing the building to burst into fierce flames. Nearly 1,000 survivors were trapped inside the building. Hundreds of people from floors 91 and 92 decided to jump to their deaths, unable to bear the heat and suffocating smoke. News spread rapidly across all national television channels. Some reporters claimed the plane that hit the North Tower was a small twin-engine jet, completely failing to notice the massive hole it left behind. This misinformation was relayed to President George Bush while he was visiting an elementary school in Florida. The presidential office speculated that the accident was certainly due to pilot error. No one suspected the true nature of what had happened on Flight 11. Evacuations were taking place in both towers, but people still thought it was simply an accident, unaware that the next disaster was about to strike. Right after seizing control of Flight 175, the hijackers had the plane deviate from its designated flight path. This signal could be observed by the New York Air Traffic Control Center. They tried to contact the flight crew but received no response. Inside the cabin, passengers and flight attendants made calls to their loved ones and families. At 8:52, a male flight attendant named Robert Fangman called United Airlines maintenance office in San Francisco to report the hijacking. After 1 minute and 15 seconds, Fangman's call was disconnected. The aircraft's communication and reporting system received a message. I heard about an incident reported on your aircraft. Please verify that all is well. Knowing their actions had been discovered, the terrorists' madness reached its peak. The plane nearly collided mid-air with Delta Airlines Flight 2315. On the ground, air traffic controller Dave Batiglia tried to direct the aircraft to turn around but was unsuccessful. Instead, Flight 175 continued to accelerate toward Flight 2315. In the final seconds, Flight 2315 managed to veer off course and escape the collision by a hair's breadth. At 8:52, male passenger Peter Hansen called his father. Hansen was traveling with his wife and their 2-year-old daughter, the youngest passenger on the flight. It's getting really bad. Dad, a flight attendant got stabbed. They have knives and a bomb too. Everyone's scared. The plane's shaking violently. I think we're going down. They're going to crash into some building. Don't worry. Dad, if it happens, it'll be very quick. At 8:58, Flight 175 flew over New Jersey at 500 feet, heading toward New York City. Within 5 minutes, the plane continuously increased speed while rapidly decreasing altitude. At exactly 9:03, at 800 km per hour, the Boeing 767 crashed straight into the South Tower of the World Trade Center, penetrating between floors 77 and 85. A fireball erupted, and black smoke columns made the sky even more ominous. 2 planes had consecutively crashed into the twin towers of the World Trade Center complex, leading to the collapse of all 7 towers in the area. Music! The entire United States finally awakened. President George Bush announced on national television from the Pentagon, "We are experiencing a national tragedy. 2 passenger planes being hijacked and deliberately crashed into the World Trade Center is clearly a terrorist attack." And America. After 2 hijacking attacks, American Airlines ordered a nationwide halt to operations. Calls from Indianapolis Air Traffic Control and coordinators to their Flight 77, which had just taken off at 8:20, carrying 68 passengers and 6 crew members from Dulles International Airport in Northern Virginia to Los Angeles International Airport, and were all unsuccessful. The reason was that at this time, it was also under the control of terrorists, 5 Saudi Arabian men led by Hani Hanjour, who had obtained an FAA commercial pilot certificate in April 1999. They had attacked the cockpit since 8:51 and took only 3 minutes to seize control of the aircraft. The terrorist group had the plane deviate from its designated flight path near the vicinity of Parkersburg. They turned off the transponder and activated autopilot mode. Immediately after, they turned the plane east toward Washington. The target had been changed, and this time it was the Pentagon, the headquarters of the U.S. Department of Defense. Around 9:17 to 9:22, Hanjour made an announcement over the cabin's public address system, informing those on the plane that the aircraft was being hijacked and requesting passengers not to resist. Everyone would be safely landed once the ransom was paid. At 9:29 a.m., he turned off autopilot mode and began manual control. The plane moved at speeds up to 550 km per hour and descended very rapidly. At 9:37, when only about 0.8 km from the target, the Boeing 757 executed a 330-degree clockwise spiral. The altitude was reduced to just 670 meters. The hijacker pushed the throttles to full power and crashed straight into the west side of the Pentagon. All 64 people on the flight died instantly, along with 125 people working in the Defense Department building. Shortly after the attack on the Pentagon, all American airspace became a no-fly zone. However, at that moment, one aircraft still appeared in the sky. Defying orders, it was a Boeing 757-200 on United Airlines Flight 93, the 4th flight in the terrorists' plan. Due to congestion at the airport, at 8:42, this flight was finally permitted to take off from Newark International Airport in New Jersey, bound for San Francisco International Airport in California. Applause. People later wished that the flight had been delayed just a few more minutes. Then perhaps the following story wouldn't have been so tragic. The plane carried 37 passengers, including 4 hijackers led by Ziad Jarrah. The flight was controlled by 4 crew members, Captain Jason Dahl and First Officer Leroy Homer Jr. At 9:03, when Flight 175 crashed, the plane had climbed to cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The flight crew received a warning from air traffic control to be careful of any cockpit intrusions. 2 planes had crashed into the World Trade Center. At this point, the captain was still unaware of the terrorists' presence until 9:28, when they stormed the cockpit and overpowered the pilots. A struggle ensued. Air traffic control on the ground, while communicating with the flight, heard desperate screams from the first officer's cockpit. "Get out of here! Get out of here!" Upon receiving the emergency distress signal from the flight, the supervisor monitoring West Coast flights immediately notified the command center under the Federal Aviation Administration in Virginia. First Officer Homer was pushed down to the passenger cabin. The two remaining hijackers herded all passengers to the rear to minimize passenger interference. At 9:31, Jarrah turned on the speaker to make a false announcement to them. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain. Please remain seated. We have a bomb on board the aircraft." Once again, the ringleader had pressed the wrong switch, and what he said was transmitted to ground control. At 9:39, 2 minutes after Flight 77 collided with the Pentagon, he continued announcing that the plane would return to the airport, but finally, their cruel plan had been discovered. Information about the attacks on the World Trade Center had spread to flight attendants and passengers. They realized they were about to die, and many other people on the ground were also preparing to face death. A total of over 37 calls were made from the plane. An unspoken vote took place that a group of flight attendants and passengers agreed they must regain control of the aircraft and not let the hijackers achieve their goal. At 9:52, a battle cry was raised. "Are you guys ready? Okay. Let's roll." They used the service cart to begin attacking the hijackers. A melee broke out. Seeing the situation deteriorating, Jarrah began controlling the plane violently in retaliation. The aircraft continuously rolled in the sky while trying to change course toward Washington, D.C., causing the plane to lose control. It was traveling at 906 km per hour. At 10:01, learning that 2 comrades had been killed, Jarrah recited the Shahada. He decided to crash the plane into the ground at 10 hours, 2 minutes, and 17 seconds. It seemed the counterattack group had gotten inside the cockpit. At 10 hours, 2 minutes, and 33 seconds, the hijacker continued screaming in Arabic, "Give it to me! Give it to me!" Finally, he pushed the control stick, causing the plane to crash into an abandoned field in the town of Stony Creek Township, Pennsylvania. At 10 hours, 3 minutes, and 6 seconds, all 44 people on board perished. The attacks in American skies on the 11th of September killed 2,996 people and injured over 6,000 others. Only later did people learn that the Capitol, the U.S. Congress building, was the target of the hijackers on Flight 93. If not for the brave sacrifice of those passengers, the casualties and injuries that day could have been much higher. Conspiracy theories about the 11th of September. Media worldwide has spent far too much ink on the horrific tragedy that occurred over 20 years ago. But to this day, people continue to ask whether this was a legitimate excuse for America to launch the Iraq War 2 years later. These theories suggest that the attacks were deliberately allowed to happen or were a false flag operation conducted by the U.S. government. According to a poll conducted in 2006, more than 1/3 of the American public suspected that federal officials had assisted the terrorists in the 11th of September attacks or had taken no action to prevent them. With the intention of giving the United States a pretext to wage war in the Middle East, here are some pieces of evidence presented. First, the North American Aerospace Defense Command provided no timely assistance despite distress calls and information about hijacked planes being confirmed and reported to air traffic control stations. Second, the hole in the Pentagon walls was too small if created by a Boeing 757. And third, through an investigation, it was found that put options on United Airlines and American Airlines stocks, 4T, allowing profit from the decline in these airline stock prices, were purchased in large quantities before the 11th of September. This led to speculation that insiders might have known about the 11th of September events in advance and had participated in corresponding betting. What's your opinion on this matter?